So tonight is a very sort of a poignant moment for me looking back on the second exhibition that we did at NYU Abu Dhabi. We had just opened the new campus on Saadiyat, and the gallery had just opened. And then this exhibition, Slavs and Tatars, Mirrors for Princes, Both Sides of the Tongue, opened in spring of 2015. And so this is 5 years, over 5 years now since that moment. And in the Trace series, we're working our way back through our exhibition history. So this is the second to last event, looking at exhibitions from the past. And I've been here for the whole thing, and I would like to say that, you know, the moment when Slavs and Tatars agreed to take a chance on a new exhibition space in Abu Dhabi on a desert island, it was a really great moment for us, and I'm really glad to be reunited tonight. And I'm going to introduce tonight we have speaking with us Payam from Slavs and Tatars and Anthony Downey as well, who worked on the book publication. And I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves, if you would. Payam, would you start?
Hi, everybody. Great to see some familiar faces and some new ones. My name is Payam. I'm one of the co-founders of Slavs and Tatars. And at the time we did the show, I think in Abu Dhabi, we had just barely moved to Berlin, I think. So now we've been in Berlin about 6 years now. And before that, we were working all of us remotely and only meeting via Skype in a precursor to current pandemic work platforms.
Hi, everybody, and likewise, it's nice to see some familiar handles out there. My name is Anthony Downey. I am Professor of Visual Culture in the Middle East at Birmingham City University. It's there I work with PhD students, research students, in and around, mostly subject matter related to the Middle East, North Africa, and Global South. The two big projects I'm working on at the moment is a 4-year AHRC-funded research award looking at education and digital methods in Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. I'm also working on a series of books at the moment for the research practice series, which we launched last year. My involvement with the project was being invited in 2014 by Payam to commission and edit the volume that accompanied it. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we proceed.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And I want to I'm going to take a moment and do a little product placement. This is the book that we worked on together. And I remember first meeting Anthony in the course of the preparation for this, and hearing the artists talk about the book process in a way that's so radically different from how we think about a catalog. And we'll get into that as well. But I want to start now by taking our audience back in time to 2015. And I'm going to do that by sharing my screen. So bear with me, that always takes a minute to get it right. I think I got it. Okay, you should see the landing page for Slavs and Tatars. So this is, as we've worked our way through this series, what we're doing is we're taking our exhibition pages and we've completely rebuilt them essentially as archives for the exhibition project. So what you see here, instead of the original marketing image, is the installation view of one of the works that was in the exhibition. On this page, in addition to a summary of the project, there's usually an excerpt of the essay, installation views and event views, but also that you can download the entire book, which is also available on Slavs and Tatars website, as well as the brochure, the press release, and we can look at them also on FlipSnack, which is this nice little app that allows you to read online. So I would hope that this will be a resource for people who want to go back and see this exhibition. I know that at the time, you know, the visitors to Saadiyat Island were not as in large a volume as they were before the pandemic in the last few years. So I think there are many of our audience members who wouldn't have seen it. So here we have the arrival into the gallery space would have been from the left, and you'll see the first main room here. There's a collection of different works, some of which were created specifically for this project and some of which existed earlier in the cycle. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly and then ask Payam to talk a little bit more about the work. And this was a piece that was the piece used to promote the exhibition in the beginning. These are, these mirrored sculptures had sound coming out of them, which we'll also go into. And then in the second room is, there was this piece, a very mysterious dark piece with the wind blowing. It's called Sheikha. And there's a fan that it's moving in the wind, and you're in this sort of darkened black light space where we have additional sculpture. So there's a real contrast between the two spaces. And then to go to the events, in the entrance of the lobby, we had a piece called Kitab Kebab, which is part of a series that they make, and people wearing the turbans, which we'll also come back to, and some other views of the installation. One of the most important things for us was that the artists created this space that that we thought of as a tea house, that really merges a lot of components of what you might find in our regional furniture, for example, but also provided a special kind of tea to all the visitors. And this room, because of the inspiration actually of this exhibition, we've converted this ultimately into a reading room. So I want to thank Slavs and Tatars for helping us rethink what had been a fairly sterile classroom as a space for engaging the ideas of the exhibition. This is the faculty on opening night and some of the readings that the artists selected to develop the ideas of the exhibition. And on the windows of that space was this incredible vinyl that from the inside looked as if you were in this landscape with these flags and desert. Okay, so that's my quick tour, whirlwind tour through this. And I wanted to go back now and ask Payam if he would talk about this piece in particular as the introduction to the exhibition, which had a version of which had opened at Kunsthal Zurich and then traveled to us and then to other locations. And in each location it's totally different, but this, I understand, was a key part of that. So Payam, over to you.
Yeah, this piece is called Circles and Squares of Justice. And it was an important piece, both, I mean, and I think one thing I want to talk about tonight is really how works are perceived differently, experienced differently according to their location. This is essentially what you saw in the window that Maya had shown earlier, of this landscape, this vinyl onto the window, is a scene from the Uyghur region, officially known in China as Xinjiang, which I think, of course, has come back into the news, sadly, over the past couple of years. It was really the inspiration, the kind of the text, everything began in this cycle from a book called Mirrors for Print. So a book called The Wisdom of Royal Glory. And I'm going to do some product placement from some medieval product placement. This is it's an 11th, 12th century text. Essentially the kind of most important, this is the thickness of it. This is the most important, it's the most important Turkic text. Essentially the equivalent of something like Beowulf or Nibelungen in German, or Beowulf in English, or Les Chants Rolands in French. It's kind of foundational Turkic text. Everybody in Turkey knows it. Very few people have read it. And I just wanted to mention that because, of course, this Uyghur origins was sort of carried through in this first piece that Maya shown. If we can go back to the turbans. The turbans, they're essentially turbans that hang outside of a khanwa, or a kind of a takia, kind of a Sufi lodge, or these shrines across the Uyghur region in Western China. And they're actually, they look very much like ammamez, which are Shia turbans. Of course, they have nothing to do with Shiism or Sunnism, but they announce a kind of a religious space or a spiritual space. And that it was important as a kind of this confounding notion of when you're walking into an exhibition space, which is considered to be quintessentially a kind of secular space, at least in the Western understanding, or in the modern understanding of exhibition space, is really somewhere that's secular, especially if we take these kind of analogies that people have been using over the past 30, 40 years of spaces of culture becoming kind of the new cathedrals of culture, or the kind of the equivalent of what cathedrals and maybe libraries were in up to the 18th, 19th century. And of course, putting this somewhere like Zurich, in the Kunsthaus Zurich, or somewhere as in Abu Dhabi, have vastly different connotations. Not only in terms of the kind of the lack of distance in Abu Dhabi, people just felt comfortable taking them and wearing them, which was enjoyable. But also, it reminds me of something Juan Gaitan said when he invited us to do the 8th Berlin Biennale. He said, you know, if you can maintain this ambiguity that in your work, where people don't know whether it's serious or it's a mockery, whether it's fictitious or it's real, your research, whether it's religious or it's secular, whether it's critical of religion or it's celebrating religion, basically it's kind of, if you can maintain these kind of almost antithetical positions in the work, that's a strength, because at that time, he said, you know, people don't really know what to do with it. And that's something that I think becomes more and more of a challenge the further your career develops, because people know what to expect. And I think as an artist, that's the hardest part, is to maintain that ambiguity the further along you go. Because as soon as, I think you've lost a certain amount of the power of art, as soon as it's clearly identifiable as such. That is, I would say the overwhelming majority of art, including contemporary and conceptual art, is exhibited and hung and installed and mediated to be clearly visible as contemporary art. And that's, if you think about that for a second, that's quite depressing because you've kind of given away all your cards right away as to what the kind of the phenomenological reaction that a viewer has with the work. And I think that, of course, becomes much more complicated somewhere like Abu Dhabi, where there isn't a codified culture of exhibition going, let's say, to the extent that there is in other places like Zurich, for example. And I think that's actually what becomes quite exciting about an audience in Abu Dhabi, especially an audience that's as stratified as the one in Saadiyat Island was, right? Because it was really, yeah, I mean, there's the whole access issue, of course, in Saadiyat in 2015. I'm not sure if it still is relevant today, but it's not easy to, it's not part of the city center, at least it wasn't then.
It's definitely much more active, but I think for many people in Abu Dhabi, it still feels like a distant place. Yeah, like it could be another city. And the arrival experience with these hats, and we instructed the guards to tell people they could try them on, right? And which feels also, if you are somebody who recognizes them as having a spiritual function, that in itself feels slightly subversive, or like, who am I to be wearing this turban? This turban doesn't belong to my culture. So tell us why you put these at the beginning of the exhibition and how you imagined them engaging.
Well, I mean, one of the things, to be honest, it goes to the heart of why we started Slavs and Tatars, and that was really, we started not really, I mean, the regional focus is, I wouldn't say it's a red herring, but it's a kind of, it's a MacGuff, or whatever you call it, kind of plot mechanism. It's essentially a means for us to explore other types of knowledge. And we felt that the kind of knowledge that we were being taught for all intents and purposes was a purely analytical, cerebral, let's just say, knowledge. And there's first of all, there's as many types of knowledge as there are organs of knowledge, I would say. So sort of affective, digestive, metaphysical, so on and so forth. But there's also, hopefully, as many types of knowledge as there are places of knowledge. And that's something, again, which that's really comes to also why the kind of the work we do is you know, we've noticed there's a kind of lazy consolidation of curricula around the world. And whether you're learning in sort of, you're studying in Jakarta, in Tehran, or in Moscow, or in Heidelberg, you're kind of learning the same Enlightenment genealogy of history and of philosophy. And that's quite sad. Again, not because of any kind of conspiracy, but just because of the kind of a lazy homogeneity or consolidation. And this piece for us was a kind of way to play with that Shia Sunni misunderstanding, which it has nothing to do with, but of course it has those touch points because it resembles Shia headgear, kind of the imams of Shia hierarchy, and also the relationship between a space being somewhere to delve into religious or secular subject matter. And that really, of course, the name of the exhibition, Mirrors for Princes, was really going to this, to the very heart of this secular sort of religious divide, if you will, in the sense that Mirrors for Princes are a medieval genre of advice literature, and they're considered to be the kind of first form of political science. So until the 10th, 11th century, most scholarship around the world, whether it was in the Muslim world or the Christian world, was religious in nature. So religious jurisprudence, theology, and Mirrors for Princes were the first type of text that tried to create a model or template for statecraft. And if we fast forward 1,000 years to today, I would argue that we have a kind of a logoria, or everybody and their sort of grandmother is a political expert / blogger or commentator, and we have precious few sources on the role of faith in public life. So it's kind of, the pendulum has swung to the other extreme. And these...
And then when we enter what we're looking at actually were sculptures that make sound, and you hear the sound of these many different languages and voices. And I remember you describing the hats at the entrance as a sign that the elders had gathered, and that this kind of speaks to this idea of statecraft and of political education to prepare for leadership, and that this is this kind of combination of the religious and the political coming together in this moment here. And then we'll come back to that subject, but I wanted to look at this one piece, which is related to the title of our exhibition. Had a subtitle that was different from other locations. So Mirrors for Princes was a cycle that showed in multiple places, but ours was called Both Sides of the Tongue. And do you remember the story of how that came to be? I think that this work is related to it, but.
I don't know if I recall the story. I remember that it's definitely, it occurred. I mean, definitely it speaks to the Arabic language and the Gulf or the Khaliji version of Arabic, let's say. Apparently, Arabic is, one of the monikers of Arabic is known as the Lisan al-Dad, or the language of the Dad, this letter on the right.
Okay.
And it is a very specific phoneme in the Arabic language. It's very difficult to pronounce. It's kind of, so the left and the right are a stad and a dad, and they're kind of an S and a Z, but in the back of your throat. And this is painted over Barthes SZ, which is a kind of an analysis of a Balzac novella, where a bourgeois man from Paris falls in love with an opera singer in Italy, who happens to be a castrato, and so he discovers that she is actually a he, and Barthes does this kind of brilliant structuralist kind of analysis where he compares sort of heterosexual versus homosexual, male versus female, kind of the Freudian impulse to death versus the kind of the life voice of the opera. And we thought this S and the Z were kind of an interesting mirroring, because of course this is the kind of the Arabic SZ, if you will, the Sad and the Dad, and allowed us to kind of carry that binary even further in sort of uncharted places, I guess.
Thank you very much. It was a nice sort of late addition to the title, and I remember that being especially striking that this piece was there. And then there's the carpet that's on the wall is this very soft pink carpet. And one of the things that was really nice for me was this move away from the white cube kind of aesthetic, this particular iteration. I think that your work in general moves away from that aesthetic, but in our gallery, which is fairly large, the work would have kind of disappeared into the whiteness. So I'm going to stop the screen share now. And I want to talk a little bit about the book. And I wonder, Anthony, you mentioned thinking about the book and about this project from the perspective of today, looking back 5 years. And I think that I know you first as the person who was responsible for Abraz, but I know that you have done many other things. And it sounds like now your thinking has continue to develop, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how this project looks to you now, and any anecdotes or stories about that time.
Thank you, Maya. Yes, I mean, it's, for me, preparing for this was interesting. I didn't want to just reiterate what we did at the time. It was very interesting to go back and look at what has stuck with me. I think the thing that probably stuck with me most was Payam's appalling driving from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, which frankly left me in a catatonic state by the time I arrived in the gallery. This is not an anomaly. He's a terrible driver per se in any city. But apart from that, he approached me in 2014, and it was very interesting to think about two things. What would a catalog look like in relation to a show such as this? Because the question, I think, goes right to the heart of what Slavs and Tatars set out to do in relation to the register or the knowledge that they produce. And it became obvious through the conversation with Payam that, in fact, this was not going to be a catalog as we understand it. It certainly was not going to illustrate the show. So this then became very interesting for me. How do you produce a book which is effectively touring with a show, but to all intents and purposes is not about the show? So we set out over a number of conversations in relation to that to produce something that could stand on its own 2 feet, independent of the show. So imagine if the show had never happened. What would that book look like? And in fact, looking back now, I feel quite sort of, dare I say, pleased that the book stands alone. It stands independent of the show. Of course, it's imbricated within the reality of that show and the themes that were produced as a result of it, the practice and so forth. But between Paya, myself, and dare I say others involved in this, we did manage to commission some excellent writers who wrote, and again, dare I say, quite academic studies of mirrors for princes, coming at it from very different angles, I must say. So Lloyd Ridgen coming at it from the question of grooming as a literal element, how do you groom the self? But also as a metaphysical element, how do you groom the self for power? I think of Anna Della Suban as well, thinking about translation, and this has been something that has stood with me and stuck with me quite considerably, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'm also thinking that the book itself could, for example, take out all reference to Slavs and Tatars, dare I say, and you would still have a volume that would be an excellent introduction and extrapolation of what contemporary mirrors for princes could possibly be, and what we mean by the historical context of mirrors for princes. And I think for anybody in the audience, I think perhaps the main reference point would be a good example of a mirror for princes would be Machiavelli's The Prince, published in 1532, I think about 4 or 5 years after his death. And the book itself is very much about offering advice, grooming someone for power, in that instance, the sovereign. And I think, again, this book as it stands, the book that we have here today, this is again an excellent introduction to that and could contain all of those arguments. So thinking back, that specifically has stuck with me. And I'm pleased to go back and look at it now 5 years later, which frankly seems a lifetime ago, and feel that the book would still offer to anyone looking for historical context, but equally historical purchase on this notion, could happily pick up this book and find it there. I don't know how much more you want me to say, but I think there was something else about translation. Do you want me to continue, Maya, or shall we come back to it?
Yeah, well, should we? I mean, I think one of the key things here is to understand what a mirrors for princes is, and I think that it's not always a commonly traded idea. And I think one of the things that was so striking about this exhibition for me was starting to think about, you know, this is a text, the original one, and I can never say the name, the one that the exhibition is based on, Kutagdu Billig. Thank you, I am. It's not easy. It's been a long time since I've practiced it too, is that it was advice from sort of a spiritual and leader advisor to the king about how to raise their son. And that the Slavs and Tatars approach this as also like a modern day self-help book, right? So there's grooming in both registers of that word that shows up throughout the exhibition. And I think the key thing that that happens in that is that you have this sense of authority that comes from the text. And then these sort of plays on the notion of grooming. So when we went through the exhibition, you might have seen a couple of things that look like combs for hair. There's a whole section that deals with how you present your hair as an indicator of your grooming, sort of in a social, political sense, which turns out to actually be true. And it's one of the registers how we can sort of read racist narratives in the United States, for example, is by how people judge hair that looks like it belongs to a certain ethnicity, for example. And that was a really striking moment. I remember walking through the exhibition with somebody who wears quite a bit of makeup, and I am not somebody who does that. And it's just a difference between us. But in that moment, I thought, she's much more groomed than me. And I should probably work on this, right? Locally, it just depends on what your context is, how you understand what grooming, how that should register should happen. So I thought it would be nice to hear what it sounds like in that, in the gallery during that. So I'm going to see if I can go back to that, the audio. Did you want to talk about the structures that make the sound of the work?
Yeah, these speakers are essentially the references to Rahle, so the book stand that we often use in our work, and it's a kind of a book stand used for holy texts in Islam, but you actually find examples of it in Orthodox Christianity and Greek churches as well as Judaism.
Right, okay. So now I will see if I can get the audio to work. And for you to really hear it, I think I need to share my screen. Okay, here we go.
Weisheit ist die Zunge der
اللسان
Dolmetscher.
ترجمان العلم والإدراك.
Bu ravan tilne
İnsanı
kişinin
aydınlatan
yoğurtçı
Wisse, das klare Rede die
فاعرف
Erde
قيمة
erleuchtet.
البيان الذي يعبر عنك يا إنسان.
til kişinin kadrine
Kişiyi
aşırır.
kıymetlendirir ve kişi onu. Die Menschen verleiht die Zunge
به
Ehre.
يكسب الإنسان قيمته.
Onun bilen kişi
Kişiyi
bahil
zil
eyleşir.
eğmekten düşürür. Hier findet er Glück.
وبه ينال سعادته.
Til kişini horlap koydu.
Ve
Onun bilen
Lügen
arının
lässt.
beşiğidir.
Die Zunge erniedrigt.
And so I think one of the only, this was in each of the mirror images that I showed, the mirrored, the lector, was each section had a different language, and every time the work showed in a different country, it had a different language. So one of the things we did was generate record the Arabic reading of this text. So what you're doing is you walk in and you're being read to the Mirrors for Prince's text that the show is based on or developed from in multiple languages that you may or may not be able to understand. Is that right, Payam?
Yeah, and maybe I can mention also the fact that the languages are overlapping each other is reference to the kind of a voice-over technique that you find in news segments often, where you hear the original, but then somebody else is being basically translating over. And this is again something which we found an interesting dynamic, because first of all, as a kind of anecdote, in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russia, still to this day, films are shown in this way. So you hear the original soundtrack, and then you have the translator, usually one person, translating the whole thing. I remember the first time I listened, I experienced this was in St. Petersburg in the 90s, mid-90s, and I went to a Pasolini film, and there was one woman literally just translating in Russian, and she just continues the whole time, and I thought this is like almost like a performance piece, right? Because this interpreter is basically winging it live for 2 hours in Russian, and they're not turning down the Italian, so you can hear the Italian blasting in one from one direction and in the Russian another. And it's a really interesting dynamic because it has this kind of element of respect and disrespect. So it's in some ways disrespectful to speak over somebody, but it's respectful because you're trying to make them understood. So it's a kind of also what David Crowley in the essay that Anthony commissioned it calls it's a kind of a poor man's maximalism also, because essentially audiences in Russia and Poland want to hear the original voice, but they want to understand as well. So they're not willing to go for the kind of the usual dubbing where you silence the original voice and you overlay it with somebody else's. And then to to the question of reciting, that's very important, of course. I mean, despite our investment in print, I mean, I think we've published over almost 12 books now. We do understand the kind of suspicion of print that oral culture brings and that reciting brings. And we actually found that the voice is actually from an adolescent boy. It's the only voice of all the languages we did. We did in the end, I think, around 10 or 11 languages when this show had sort of finished touring. And this is the only one who wasn't an adult. And he was actually a student of tajweed. So this kind of the reciting of the Quran, which is all about oral skills and kind of oral training, essentially, reciting essentially.
And my memory of why you chose at that point to record the voice of somebody who's still a teenager is to capture the perspective of the prince who's being groomed, something like that. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So at this point, we're about a little over halfway through the hour. I want to remind people that although you're muted right now, we really invite you to jump in and ask questions. Sebastian can be feeding those questions to us, or we can respond to them as we see them. So please feel free to type into the chat if you have questions. And I want to shift us now to these kind of what I think of as the meta questions, which is how do we read art and how is art legible? And so the art that we just looked at could be explained, and a lot more comes to you as you start to hear the stories of what's behind the thinking of the presentation of what we're looking at versus what you might experience when you first encounter it. And one of the number one sort of responses that we would get is that people wish they had an audio guide of Payam talking about the work to go through the show. And as a result of this, actually, we started doing audio guides because I tend to curate shows that need a lot of explaining. So I was wondering, Payam and also Anthony, if you could talk to us a little bit about how you think about legibility. And the reason I'm especially interested in this with regard to Slavs and Tatars is because their work has a lot of references that are immediately recognizable to many of our audiences in Abu Dhabi that might not be immediately recognizable to the audiences I had in Providence, Rhode Island in the US. And these are references both to sort of Arabic cultural references, Iranian cultural references, Islam, and just material culture that is legible here that it might not be as legible to an audience somewhere else. So I'm wondering, because Slavs and Tatars' work shows so much in what I think of as this corridor, North American and European art contexts that tend to frame a lot of the conversations we hear about contemporary art internationally. What happens, with your audiences when you're in Zurich versus your audiences? I know that you've shown in Sharjah, and Dubai, and Abu Dhabi, and then also Texas. So take us a little bit through that. But also, Anthony, I'd love to hear, because you work constantly in this shuttling. You're dealing with regions that for many of your English language readers might be somewhat illegible. And I guess this question I find especially interesting because as a curator working here has really forced me to be rigorous in my thinking about the audience and how the audience activates the art differently depending on who that audience is. So over to you.
Sorry, Mike, do you want me to respond?
You want to jump in, Anthony? I can follow up.
Yeah, I mean, very, very simply, and perhaps simplistically, I think one way around this is always to look at practice. What does art as a performative gesture produce in terms of its knowledge through its own practice? And I think if you start at that point, you hopefully avoid, to a certain extent, regionalizing or reiterating or indeed replicating that regional model, so to speak. But I think specific to Slavs and Tatars, and I'm just going to go back a little, talking about reception, how audience receive it. I was thinking specifically about forms of cultural translation and how that is tackled through the practice of Slavs and Tatars. So the work that we just looked at, Lector, for example, that employs, going back to what Payam was talking about, simultaneous translation, also known as Gavrilov translation, where the two voices are in competition. So you have the original voice. So for example, in Poland in the 70s and 80s, the film of Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, for example, if I understand correctly, it would have the original, and then it would have the Polish translation in competition. Now this is really interesting because what you get there is the dilemma of translation itself, the dilemma of cultural translation. It can be literal, and therefore you do only end up with a literal translation. But no translation can ever be literal. It has to change its origin. It will change it through coming together in that moment. It will change it through metaphor. It will change it through what's left over or what's not addressed in the translation. And I often think of this as a potential model for understanding what that show was doing in many ways. It was showing the cultural translation or the forms of cultural translation in play at any specific moment. And more specifically, it was playing with the notion of allegory, with metaphor, a sort of unexpected emergence of what happens when you put two cultures side by side. And the thing that I kept thinking about was Anne Carson, the Canadian translator and poet, the way she tackles translation, because she literally tackles it. She doesn't just deal with translation as an inert sort of literalization or transliterization, but she deals with it as a so-called third space where she creates or decreates, to use her phrase, the very notion of cultural translation, the very ideal of translation. So when you go back, for example, and look at Anne Carson's translation of Antigone, or you look at her translation of Aristeas, you effectively have a new work in and of itself. And I would like to think that would be one way of understanding what Slavs and Tatars are doing with cultural translation. You get two things coming together, and by virtue potentially of a dialectic, you have a third thing emerging, but in that moment, it's also being deconstructed. And I quite like this tension because the conflict of register for an audience, I think, is quite disarming. It's quite discombobulating. I think a lot of people find it, I wouldn't say difficult. I don't think it's a difficulty. It's interesting that people ask for an audio guide. Obviously, the book we worked on was just not up to the job of explaining the work, which is potentially what we were trying to do. But it's interesting they asked for an audio guide to navigate the work in question, because that again would be another form of translation, which would potentially again create something else, a residue or something left over from the original. So yes, these are the kind of take homes I had from that particular encounter at the time, specifically around audience reception and how audience engage with the complexity of that.
I'll jump into that. Sorry about that noise. This is, of course, our convenient DHL guy. So the interesting, for one thing that Beatrix Roof, the curator of the Zurich iteration of the show, mentioned in the book, actually, and we hadn't thought about that until that moment, which is that basically the large part of most art that deals with translation talks about its failings, right? We know about this intellectually. The translation never works. There's no such thing as translation. And she mentioned that actually the thing that struck her about our work is that there's a kind of there's a belief in its powers. That is, that I wouldn't say a positivism in translation, but that our work is always proposing that translation is actually possible and worthwhile, despite all its shortcomings. And I think that's what when you have this Gavrilov technique, you have what Anthony mentioned, you have this tension of several languages competing, but you do have the possibility to learn and to hear. So there's an effort being made to make it accessible. And I think this is why one of the readings that we shared before the Zoom was a profile of C.R. Majani, a great sort of Calvin Tompkins profile in the 90s of the great Iranian American artist who just passed away. And C.R. Majani, he distinguishes between two things that are very important, I think, to distinguish. One is between accessibility, and other is availability. And he says that basically we should basically make the works of it's a kind of I would say a progressive populism to make works available to everybody, but accessibility simply depends on how much you invest into the work. So, it's something that with Maya and I have spoken about. For the first 5 or 6 years of our practice, there was a healthy, I guess, suspicion of our work being able to stand on its own without these kinds of platforms discussing it without me being there or somebody else mediating it. And I remember Kathy Halbrecht actually was in Sharjah at the Sharjah Biennial. And before we were invited for the MoMA show, she said, you know, how do we do, what if you're not here to explain all this? And it took me many years to understand the unacceptability of that question. And what I mean by that is that nobody asks, for example, if you go to see a Carl Andre show or a kind of let's say a canonical work of 20th century modern art, nobody asks for you, there's not a requirement that you understand the entire history of minimalist art and what led to that in the 20th century. But you can understand it on any number of levels, purely formal, purely spatial and phenomenological. And I think similarly, I would hope that our work really is very aware of its own mediation. So that what I mean by that is that we make sure that the work is available to as wide a public as possible, but what is taken from it depends on how much anybody invests in it. So if somebody simply goes to the show in Abu Dhabi and enjoys the lighting or the carpet, or enjoys purely the kind of the prettiness, let's say, the aesthetics of certain objects, the finish of certain objects, that's fine. That's just as legitimate as somebody who's read the genre of medieval advice literature. There's not a kind of hierarchy of understanding. And in what we hope to do in that is essentially we're trying to maybe to supplant or kind of replace the privileged knowledge base of audiences. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we've been asked many times recently to take shows out of the city centers and present like in an outskirt of Moscow, in the Fortovo or outskirt of Philadelphia. And we've always refused because we actually think that it's not that the work shouldn't be available to marginalized communities, but we should actually make sure that the exhibition space as such is as open to that community itself. So what our work is doing in some sense, without really, I think we don't plan it as such, but because our work doesn't deal with contemporary art, but deals with all these cultural, let's say regional, whatever you want to call them, traditions, rituals, religious rites, etc., is that it privileges a different knowledge base from an audience. So instead of the normal, let's say Western educated person who's fluent in the history of modern and contemporary art, our work actually privileges the person who's more familiar with the munazara, with tajweed, with certain notions of hospitality in the Caucasus. So regional issues that are not necessarily your most prioritized knowledge bases in the world of contemporary art. So, and that's, I think, why we're so often invited by museums, because they say to us, you know, we want to bring in the Russian audience in New York, which doesn't come to art exhibitions. We want to bring in the Muslim community outside of Philadelphia who normally doesn't come to see contemporary art. And people more and more say that to us, and we have no problem with that. It's just that we're very aware of the kind of this balance of not catering to an audience, but really how do you include, how can you be as inclusive as possible in this way as opposed to this way? Sort of instead of sharpening your message and being top, how can you sort of widen your message and keep it sharp instead of sharpening downwards as opposed to sharpening upwards? I'll sort of stop there, sorry.
And so, no, I think that's it's interesting because we have a question in the chat that's related to this, but one of the most wonderful moments for me was when, you know, it's very common for people to, in my early curatorial career, for people to write off art as something they either don't understand or don't like, especially contemporary art, and to be kind of alienated by the experience of the gallery. And there was this really great moment where a student from our university went into the tea house side of the exhibition and saw the modulus furniture in the bamboo flooring or the rattan flooring, and said that he felt like that was the first time he ever felt like contemporary art could be for him, and that he felt sort of welcomed in a way that he'd never felt welcomed. And that was a really affirming moment where I realized that this question of the context of display has incredible power and danger to keep sort of reinforcing an elitist context for exhibition making and display. And the question that was related to this is, what is the relationship between your art practice and institutions where you display? And do you think that your way of thinking is influenced or affected by the institutional context? Gallery, temporary exhibition, museum, et cetera, of the exhibition, which I think you sort of answered, which is that they ask you to kind of provide a language that will draw a different audience. Is that, I think that's something.
It is, but we have to push back at times because,
yeah,
again, when you're dealing with this region like ours, I mean, yesterday Angela Haratunyan in Beirut wrote, you know, why don't I not see the messages of solidarity with Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, and Azerbaijan that I saw about Beirut, that I saw about Belarus, and one of the reasons is that our region falls through the cracks. That's just a fact. There's people are not. That's why we actually are devoted to this particular region. Is that it's not the Middle East, even though it's largely Muslim. It's not Russia, even though it's largely Russophone, at least as a second language. It's not in China. It's never been under Chinese rule, even though it's largely in Asia, right? And it's kind of, it's really, it's a region which is remote from most of our audiences, being whether it's in the West or even the Middle East. The Middle East itself glances over the Caucasus and Central Asia, doesn't barely considers a Muslim. And when you're aware of how remote your interests are, you have to make a certain effort about mediation. So I would say that when museums more and more ask us to be involved in the mediation of our work, we have to be really careful. We actually push back and say, first of all, that's your job as an institution. It's one of many things that's being pushed onto the artist, which I think is important to kind of resist, because more and more of the work is being done, I mean, by the artists as a kind of professionalization at no extra remuneration, but also because we think about the mediation of our works in the conception of the works a lot. And I don't know, at least in my colleagues, my artist friends, I don't know anybody else around me who thinks about the reception of the work as much in its conception, so that we've already done our mediation when the work is done, in some sense. The rest of the mediation is then up to the education department, the curators, the institutions. And what I mean by that is, again, it's not catering it to an audience, of course, not to the institution, but we think about it in the sense that we're facing the street as opposed to sort of our back to the street. It's kind of, it's an open, like you said, it's an inclusive, whether it's the humor is inclusive, whether the cultural references are inclusive. And what I mean by inclusive, maybe I can share my screen briefly and show, you know, an example of this from last year's Venice Biennial. And, you know, there was a wall in the central pavilion where you had, I think, 15 different panels in, I don't even know how many languages, 10 maybe languages, but all using a different script. And, you know, the Financial Times review of the Biennial, I actually wrote a letter to the editor for the first time in my life. And the reviewer, it said, next to Rosemary Trockel's works, there's works by Slavs and Tatars, which are completely illegible. And I thought, wow, that just says a lot, right? Like an English language publication accusing a work of being illegible because it's in 11 languages that are not English. I mean, what other effort do you want? I mean, there's 4 different scripts at least here, you know, like give us a break, because there's an attempt to really speak to as many people as possible in as many languages as possible, in as many alphabets as possible. And yet, of course, we're still going to fail, but that almost doesn't register. It's almost considered to be, yes, it's considered to be almost maybe too much, much like the translations or the kind of Gavrilov that Anthony mentioned.
And then we have a question from one of our audience members, which brings up the subject of COVID. And just to briefly answer this, Payam is based in Berlin. He's not from the UAE, nor is the collective, but he's done a lot of work here. In terms of today and the pandemic and sort of where things are now, has that changed how you think about the work that you're doing and thinking about sort of the future? I know this is just to sort of translate what the writer I think is asking.
I mean,
and maybe this is.
We make an effort really as much as possible not to respond to current events. And I think COVID is very much a current event, no matter how global it is. I think for us, it's important not to shift we have a very clear regional remit and COVID doesn't make it any more or less urgent, let's say.
Okay.
You know, so that's what I would sort of say about that right now.
Okay, good.
Also, just to jump in with the questions, one of the questions addresses your practice in general. What is your artistic practice like, and how do you work?
So we work, we're a collective, so we have very strict responsibilities. Each of us very different skill sets and interests. But and one thing I should say that's great about working in a collective is, and it's important, I think, is to really work with people who are very different from you. I think that one of the things that people misunderstand about Slavs and Tatars is they think that we're some kind of experts on the region, which is flattering but kind of ridiculous, because we deliberately chose a region which is too big for anybody to be an expert. You know, when it covers sort of 1/6 of the landmass, you cannot be an expert of that. So actually, what Slavs and Tatars was devoted to was to really those things which we don't understand and don't necessarily know or even like. And similarly, with the way we work, we basically have these research cycles that Maya has mentioned. Mirrors for Princes is one of them, with 8 cycles or so. And our website is organized according to cycles. These cycles last between 3 or 4 years, but they never really end. I often refer to it as kind of yogurt, so that you take a little bit of yogurt and you have to make yogurt, you have to use yogurt. So you kind of take one bacteria and make more batches of that bacteria. We do 2 kinds of research, which takes about 3 or 4 years. I get 2 or 3 years, sorry. One is bibliographic, kind of JSTOR academic scholarly research. And the second is, once we've done that scholarly research, is field research, which I guess to the COVID question, that is on pause at the moment, but to where we go and we kind of see to what extent the research that we're reading plays out in the field and affectively, experientially. Shrine worship in Central Asia, for example, is one type of sort of field research we did. And then the hardest part that Anthony mentioned is this question of translation, is how do you translate that research as an artist? What do you then bring to the table that others have not done before you, right? The people you're reading, the scholars, the activists, the journalists, the thinkers. That's the hardest part, because there's no real formula for it in a sense. Not that there's a formula for the other parts, but it's in some sense, it's the disarticulating. You know, we have 3 kinds of activities we do mostly. One is exhibition making, the art that you've seen, that Maya's shown. The second that Anthony was involved in is the book publishing. And then the third is the lectures. Now the books and the lectures, they really articulate a series of concerns, like tonight, like we're talking about. They're pretty accessible, I would say, in the language. The hardest part, the art, in my opinion, has to disarticulate. And that's really the hardest part, because first of all, what does disarticulation mean? It doesn't mean staying silent. It means literally disarticulating, unarticulating what you just articulated. So whether that means scrambling the message or like the kind of the thread that undoes the sweater, it's almost sort of disorienting yourself after you've just oriented yourself. So that's ideally what the art should do. Again, the books and the lectures, they should lead you somewhere, hopefully, but the art can't do that, I don't think. I don't think the art should lead you somewhere. The art should lead you elsewhere, in some sense, you know, in a more undefined sense, I would say.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I know Anthony has to leave at 7:30 p.m. Sharp, almost Abu Dhabi time. So if you have any questions for Anthony specifically, please type them in the chat now so that we can address them before he has to go. And in the meantime, yes, Anthony, go ahead, sorry.
I got a bit of extra time, it's fine, nobody has to.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, and then so hi Maral, thank you for joining us. She has a question for Payam. You said that you don't respond to current events like the war in Karabakh, but will you capture it in your art in the future?
You know, we're preparing a show, the opening in a couple of weeks in Nice, and I had to, and the art director wrote the introductory text about Slavs and Tatars and wrote about the region being between what we call between the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China, and he wrote, you know, a region sandwiched between empires and ravaged by war. And I really got upset. I said, you know, first of all, you know, if anywhere has been ravaged by war, it's Western Europe, right? Let's stop talking about our region as ravaged by war and conflict. And as soon as I said that, this is about 3 weeks ago, the conflict in Karabakh and Artsakh kicks off. I'm looking at what's happening in sort of, and I thought to myself, you know, we've got a residency recently where we're inviting Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine. So we've got a war in Ukraine, a war in the Caucasus, Belarus has 7 weeks of protest. Kyrgyz protests just started yesterday. And I was like, you know, I'm standing on my point was valid, but it didn't help what's happening recently. Let's put it that way. Not that, again, not that this region is any more prone or less, but to answer the question, Maral, we don't respond. It's something like this. This is what about a little bit to come back to this exhibition itself is that I find it's very important to not do what others do. And what I mean by that is that there's a tendency, I don't know whether it's an intellectual tendency, whether it's a leftist tendency, whether it's a, whatever you want to call it, art world tendency. There's a tendency for most people most of us to gravitate towards the same references. I'm not going to mention the names, whether it's certain thinkers, Rancière, Agamben, etc. Certain tendencies to look at art, conflict and art. And I think it's important for us not to not look at those things, but to do what others don't do. And that's really why we started Slavs and Tatars. And I think that what that means is to tell another side of the story, or tell the back side of the story, or approach the story from the back door and everything that means, right? The back door is where immigrants, homosexuals, and delinquents sort of hang out, right? That historically, that back door is where the help in Houston, where I grew up, was entering. And I think that what I mean by that is that we have to kind of deal with these issues in a bit less confrontational way. And I think that's why I hope our work is inclusive in the sense that, you know, we have great response from people in our region, because I think it's just an acknowledgement that the work is not essentially trying to approach the region in the same way that others are approaching the region. And that is, you know, how can we be critical, but at the same time, in a kind of festive, I don't know the word, festive, celebratory way. I mean, the hardest thing for me to do is how can I always try to describe it as how can I big up something and stab it in the back at the same time, right? With one hand, you big it up, and with the left hand, you stab it in the back. That's the hardest thing to do, because it's easy to criticize something and it's easy to celebrate something, or it's easy to, on one hand, to do very sort of clearly, or I would say evidently political heavy work. And it's also very easy to do silly work. The hardest thing is to kind of do work that does both, is to ask the silly questions and at the same time, the grave ones, or by asking this, like Mullah Nasruddin, like our mascot, essentially, how to kind of play the wise fool in some sense.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it ties a little bit into the question from Sarah Daher, who asks, or who says, I'm interested in what you mentioned about disarticulation in the art portion of your practice. I wonder how you imagine this is experienced by an uninitiated art audience who perhaps didn't attend a lecture or read a book and therefore lacks the articulation, so to speak.
Yes, that's I mean, that's a good question. It's I think what the audience is not initiated, let's say, is what I tried to say is that even the audience is not culturally articulate with the subject matter, or is not art historically let's say fluent in the subject matter. There are certain either, dare I say, formal, humorous, pop or participatory elements of the exhibition or the work that in some ways sort of aims to seduce those who would not otherwise be interested or knowledgeable about the subject matter. And that's what I mean about mediating in the actual conception of the artworks is, for example, just the fact of language, just the fact that we make sure that in every city, as I mentioned, this lector traveled. We had you know, we did it in Gaelic in Scotland. We did it in an indigenous language, Nagera in Brisbane, Australia, German in Zurich. So just ability or just interest in, of course, making sure that the heavily discursive work never relies on this kind of lazy hegemony of English. I'll give you an example. Recently, we were invited to do a lecture in Baku and 3 or 4 years ago, and the organizers wanted to do it in English, and I had to push back and say, well, if you do it in English, you're going to have a very small group of slow drip coffee drinking hipsters who are under the age of 25, 30 coming to see the lecture. And if we do it in Russian, we had 300 people, including lots of babushkas and sort of grandmas, and it was the best audience we ever had. Their grandfather, like old 67-year-old Soviet citizens with a list of comments about what I had made mistakes about, what I was wrong about, sort of, you know, you normally have people coming afterwards to kind of to get a book signed or to ask a question. They came ready to attack with the knives out, saying, you know, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right. And I thought, you know, this is the best audience you could hope for. You know, your young sort of curatorial studies audience doesn't do that. No offense to the curatorial studies departments, but.
Thank you. Yes, and then I know we're running a little bit over time, so I'm gonna allow the audience to a couple of seconds to type in one more question, and otherwise I'm gonna hand it over to Maya to close us off. But we'll wait. There we go. Ling asks, I noted that you described the consolidation of curricula around the world based on Enlightenment history or philosophy as a form of laziness, when others might describe it as a form of cultural hegemony. Could you talk more about Slavs and Tatars' attitudes or orientations towards notions of empire and hegemony?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Ling. The reason why I don't use the words empire or hegemony is that it's a word that I think can be as it can be as misleading as it can be enlightening. I think it's used too often, and I think it lets off the hook. For example, my parents come from Iran. Iran is a revolutionary regime that's resisted this cultural hegemony, and yet much of the curriculum in the universities in Iran are following. I don't think it's because they realize that they're importing it, or I think people share syllabi. So I think it's as much a laziness as it is, yes, a form of cultural hegemony. People share syllabi, and so they hear of a syllabus being taught in a university in the States, and they say, oh, I'm going to use this, and so what we're trying to do essentially is to just highlight certain lacuna or holes or gaps, big gaps, sometimes smaller ones in these educational structures and figures that we just feel like should be as important as others. And sometimes they're regional, sometimes it's simply we're very well known, like Sohravardi in Iran, let's say. But other times there are people like Johann Georg Hamann, who's like this anti-Enlightenment, the first anti-Enlightenment thinker, kind of a bad boy of the anti-Enlightenment, who was, who Kierkegaard called the greatest humorist in history. So these are people that even in Germany, nobody knows this person. It's crazy, right? So he was a kind of 18th century friend of Kant. So I would say it's equally, it's both. And towards empire, I don't know. I mean, that's in the scope of the last finishing comments. I think it's a larger discussion. I am more interested in regionalism, if I might talk about that, because Anthony, I heard you talked about regionalism in a negative light, and actually, so did the curator of the upcoming show in Nice at the Villa Arson. I'm a big fan of regionalism. Actually, I think that regions are a really interesting way to think about language groups. It's an interesting way to group people without falling into the traps of nationalism or globalism, which is globalism does nothing for me. Nationalism is scary. And regionalism allows a kind of, if I think of Central Europe and the kind of Austro-Hungarian Empire, or Silesia or Galicia, or I think of, there's certain points of affinity, I think, between peoples in a region that are often go unappreciated.
So I wanted to pick that thread up and see if I can connect it to another question that I want to ask, which is one phrase that Anthony used when we were talking before was about the neoliberal repackaging of region, I think was the phrase that he used. But also I wanted to ask, is there a mirror for princes today? How are we grooming our leaders today? And these two might be connected partly because of the loose way in which CNN talks about regions, such that you would think that the only thing that happens in the Middle East is wars and bombs and so on, and we have this image of, gardens and estates in England, and London, there's this sort of way that we think of regions so monolithically, I think. And then the question of who are these leaders and how are they being groomed and what are we looking at today? So I want this one's for Anthony, just to
Uh, yes, I would suggest that there is certainly a need for a contemporary political social science debate about what precisely a mirror for Prince could possibly be. I mean, what we're talking about here and what Payam and what Slavs and Tatars were focusing on was the kind of speculum principum, the notion of a mirror for princes, which was a medieval notion. But of course, we need something registering that today. I personally don't see anything emerging. There are social sciences, scientists, political scientists, all writing about what governance constitutes or what constitutes statecraft, but they seem to be consistently undermined by their ostensible audience, i.e. politicians. I think, Maya, to be more specific, what really interests me is the way in which social media has become its own, dare I say, mirrors for princesses or indeed princes. The way in which social media now has created that space of self-grooming, whereby the individual literally uploads themselves online as a performance, as a performance of the self. That self is registered in a virtual world, but feedback on that self comes from multiple sources. Now, if you extrapolate that and you look at a political leader, and I will not mention any names, but if you look at a political leader who affects government policy through social media and what that creates in terms of feedback or a loop or a narcissistic loop where they're only speaking to their own base, albeit through virtual media, through social media, but they are really only addressing their own base, then you have an absolute problem. And I think that problem has to do with a kind of self-serving form of narcissism whereby the only law is the law of the sovereign, which does relate back to mirrors for princes. And the very notion of power in the 15th and 16th century sense was sovereign law. What the sovereign decreed to be law was law. When the sovereign absolved or the sovereign suspended law through a state of exception, that was equally law. And we have a situation today where we are in danger of seeing that being, if not repeated, then affected across a wide spread of current issues. The suspension of law here in the UK, potentially, we are now going to be in contravention of international law. The reason that the government is giving for this suspension of international law or the abrogation of law is that they want to uphold UK law. Now, this is an interesting conundrum, and I don't want to go into too much, but the point I'll make is that this suspension of law is becoming very, very problematic. Potentially in the US over the next 4 to 5 weeks, maybe even sooner, we will see the suspension of law as we understand it. We could potentially see the suspension of an election. We could potentially see the suspension of a peaceful handover of power. This is an extraordinary thing. To even utter that sentence today is an extraordinary thing, but its potential is very real, and the impact of that globally is very real. So, an answer, and a rather roundabout way answer to your question, yes, we do need mirrors for princes, and yes, we do need an update of that, but we want to be mindful, I would argue, of the way in which social media has reconfigured that whole sort of self-help genre, that whole mediation of power, and the way in which it has literally unleashed new regimes of power. And they're not based on science, they're not based on fact, they're not based on reality, they're not based upon what we understand to be political discourse per se, they're based upon the suspension of all of those discourses.
I would also add, Anthony, to that, it's a very good point, is that there's a compartmentalization of one thing that's interesting about the original Mirrors for Princes is that they would talk to you about not only how to rule a nation, but also how to set the table, how to interact with one's loved ones. And I think that's something that if anything, this is the cycle of work which is most characteristic of what we're hoping to do with Slavs and Tatars, in the sense that to really show that all those small, seemingly insignificant things that one does in a personal, in an intimate way, are reflective of what is one doing in a social way. That is, how you drink tea, as is indicative of you as a civic person, is how you vote, right? And how you serve, how you pay for the dinner bill, how you address your neighbor, how you speak to your loved one is just a kind of in some sense a totem symbol. The whole is in the part and the part is in the whole. And today we see kind of all these kinds of self-help books and political science books, but very little that claims to do both, right? That not the kind of this introversion or the sanctuary of the self that Adam Curtis talks about, but really not sort of not escaping into one's own self to escape politics, but actually connecting the two.
Civility.
So today's self-help for leaders and rulers might include maybe activating a discourse through social media that is somehow indicative of their character as leaders. I'm going to leave it right there before it gets too depressing. But it's also interesting to think about social media as how we're connecting during a time in COVID, right? So then suddenly everything does become kind of political and personal, and it's all meshed in together through our computer screens, in fact, which are our new mirrors, one way or another. Okay, I want to wrap it up on a cheerful note, which is, Payam, you guys have a show opening in Nice in a few weeks. Is that right?
If all goes well, yeah.
I wish that I could go see it. I'm looking forward to it. It's from your new cycle, right?
Actually, no. It's our first monographic show in France, so it's going to be all the cycles. So it's a survey show essentially.
Amazing, amazing. Oh, good. Okay. All right. And thank you, Anthony, for taking time out from the world of the professor and spending some time with us over here. And thank you everyone else for your questions and for coming out. I know that it's different times for different people, and I'm glad that it worked out for us to gather. So thank you so much. Any last words, thoughts, last chance? Okay. Good. I dropped the link into the chat. Please check out the book online and enjoy the exhibition archive. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.